Whether your developers are sitting 5 feet, 10 feet apart, or they're sitting half a world apart, they suffer from some of the same challenges the open source community suffered. Understanding how to really work together and break down silos so that their best work can get done and the best skills can be leveraged in the right.
Hello, my name is Michael Francisco. I lead developer marketing for GitHub. Thank you for inviting me to join you today about GitHub, about open source, about developer velocity and inner sourcing, and how all of these things come together to help you deliver better innovation to your customers.
So today we're going to talk about open source, inner source, and developer velocity. The structure of this conversation is we're going to start a little bit talking about open source and open source growth in the greater Chinese region. We're going to talk a little bit about what we can learn from open sourcing and how that contributes to this philosophy and culture and approach that we call inner sourcing. We're going to talk about inner source, define it, come to a common agreement on what inner sourcing is, what it means, and then talk about what does it mean to actually be effective at implementing inner source within your organization and why you would want to do that. All of this accrues to developer velocity. Developer velocity is a concept and a idea that we talk a lot about, which is really focused on how do we help developers do their best work? How do we empower them in a way that makes the environment that they work in more collaborative? How do we keep them focused on the tasks and code that's really important to them and that keeps them engaged both internally and as part of their contributions to the open source community? And then also, how do we think about really freeing them up to focus on those pieces of your code that differentiate you from the rest of the market? Developer velocity is an important concept and one that I think this whole conversation today accrues to, and we'll talk more about as we go through. Let's start a little bit talking about open source in the greater Chinese region. GitHub is a global community, but 80% of developers on GitHub live outside of the United States. This chart here shows the size of the developer communities relative to the whole around the world. As you can see, China is the second largest developer community on GitHub. They make up about 14% of the total platform. And while being a big portion of the community, they're also a very active part of the community. Chinese developers in the last year made over 5.5 million contributions through GitHub to software. And so it's important to note that not only is this a growing community, but it's an active community, and we're really excited to see this development and growth over time. If we get a little bit more discrete and talk about just APAC, China makes up about 34% of the developers in APAC. About 34% of those are Chinese developers on GitHub. Again, it's a great growth and great story about how active this community is. And when we talk about growth, I'm going to throw a number out at you. This number is 37%. 37% is the developer community over the last 12 months on GitHub in China. For context, this is the fastest growth rate in the world, faster than even the United States that came in at 22%. And the United States has the world's largest developer base locally. So if you think about that, it's growing faster than the United States with the smaller developer community. We're really excited to continue to see this growth in China in their participation in open source. So it's exciting to see just kind of the general impact and growth of open source contributors and communities within GitHub, within the greater Chinese region. When we look at the importance of open source code, and we want to talk a little bit about why it's important that we're seeing such great contribution to open source from the communities in the greater Chinese region. Part of that is that open source plays a very significant and important role in the software development world at large. To highlight that point, I want to call out that 99% of projects, this is all software projects that have over 1,000 lines of code in them, have at least one open source dependency within them. And if we look on average across all software that has open source in them, or every software project, and you look at the dependencies that support those projects, on average, open source projects have over 150 dependencies, open source dependencies as part of a single project. So you start accruing this. It's not just one piece of open source software that's sitting in these code bases. It's one piece of open source software supported by over 100 different open source dependencies that kind of bring that project together. So you start thinking about the broad implications of all of these projects coming together to bring this one dependency into a code base. It's a great kind of global effort from the developer community to make this sort of work possible. And it really is a demonstration of how the community and the work the community does is a great example of the world's largest team sport. We couldn't do these things individually, but the community together has figured out how to get it done. And it's an important contribution to the world of software development. Take this a step further. If you look at the modern software supply chain, 80 to 90% of the code comes from open source. This means that the average modern software code base is made up of 80 to 90% of open source components. That means that from a differentiation standpoint, the differentiation between one software project, one code base and another really exists in that 10 to 20% of proprietary code. When you think about being able to develop software in a way that kind of makes you an innovator in your space, or really kind of drives those very unique, very enjoyable, very delightful customer experiences, by taking your same developers and focusing them on that 10 to 20% of code, you're really allowing them to focus on the stuff that really, really matters instead of reinventing the wheel. You're taking those resources that might previously been spent kind of rebuilding things, NPM libraries and things like that, that your developers would need in order to deliver that kind of last mile piece of software to customers. Now we can work with the open source community to bring those pieces in, leverage the strength of the community and hundreds and thousands of hours of development already completed, bring that into your project and allow your developers to think about and focus on those pieces of their proprietary code that really differentiate you from the competition. While the contribution of dependencies and source components and software to these broader projects is really important, it's not the only thing that we can glean and take away from open source. One of the things that we can gain from open source is learning. We can take and learn from the fact that open source is a distributed community of developers that work together to build important software. They figured out how to work effectively, asynchronously, across languages and across time zones to come together to build very important, very complex, essential pieces of software used by the rest of the world. These communities, while they maybe not have ever met in person, are efficient, they're organized, they don't share an office, nor do they share an IT department, but somehow they've managed to figure out how to share, reuse, code, and harness the skills of their peers to get work done. As we think about the modern software team, it's really important to be able to look at how have these groups organically been able to organize themselves, take those learnings and bring them inside of your development teams. Whether your developers are sitting 5 feet, 10 feet apart, or they're sitting half a world apart, they suffer from some of the same challenges the open source community suffered, understanding how to really work together and break down silos so that their best work could get done and the best skills could be leveraged in the right situations, and they weren't repeating work. Instead, they were using the work each other was doing to build on top of it, springboard into that next project, and really advance software development as a practice. So what is inner sourcing? I want to take a moment to pause and talk about what is inner sourcing. As a definition, takes the lessons learned from developing open source software and applies them to the ways that companies develop software internally. Full stop. When we think about inner sourcing, this is the definition that GitHub uses to think about what it means to be effective at inner sourcing, what it means to target an inner sourcing project. It's about learning from the open source community, bringing those practices inside your organization, and implementing them in an effective way that helps your developers expand and increase their velocity, while also helping you innovate faster and deliver better experiences to your customers. How this happens, what are the things that we need to do in order to effectively introduce inner sourcing into our organization and solve some of the challenges that we were talking about? We're talking a minute about inner sourcing fundamentals. There are 4 goals of inner sourcing that we want to really focus on. One is we want to focus on reuse. We want to reuse the code and the knowledge that is happening within one part of your organization in another part of the organization. If you have a team that has built a specific component that's unique to your code base, you don't want another team to be building that same component. You want to be able to share those things. You want to be able to provide the access to that code in a secure manner so that code that needs to be locked down because of PII or compliance or restrictions, or whatever that might be, you want to be able to share that appropriately across your organization so people feel free to share code openly and be able to use it in their various projects without having to recreate the wheel. The second piece is collaboration. We want to encourage collaboration across your organization, solving for the problem that we just talked about, not reducing that organizational distance to bring people closer together to work on code together and bring their shared and unique insights to these projects. We want to build community. We want people to work together and celebrate that working together, learn from each other's successes and learn from each other's failures, and come together as a community to celebrate that and share it so that we're constantly all getting better based upon the work of our peers. And finally, the last goal is to, as I mentioned earlier, really increase developer velocity, allow people to get to that state where they're moving as fast as they want to, being able to focus on those projects that are interesting to them and really bringing up developer satisfaction, which in turn results in better work, faster work, and greater innovation for your customers. In the end, the goal is to build better software faster. Your philosophy should be to build better software faster. Leverage inner sourcing to get the best work out of your developers, to keep your developers happy, and to ensure that you're delivering the best possible experiences to your customers. So I'll close there. As I mentioned, my email is partnerguy@github.com. If you have questions, concerns, comments, or just want to talk about this stuff, please feel free to reach out. My email is open and I'm easy to find, so I'd love to hear from you. So thank you very much for talking with me today about the inner sourcing journey, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the online forum, and I look forward to hopefully meeting some or all of you in person someday in the future.